came here so excited to find love, and I'm leaving alone.
Josh, who can't even stop partying for one night in order to spend some private alone time with the woman that he says he loves on her final night in Australia.
Don't tell me love me and then leave. Like, he is choosing his friends and partying.
It ends where a real love story is supposed to fight the hardest, and that is exactly why this moment hits so badly. Because Elise is standing at the airport saying the relationship is over, and Josh is standing right there with a kind of calm that does not look loving, does not look panicked, does not even look confused. It looks like a man hearing out loud what he may have already accepted in private, and that is what makes this feel wrong before we even get the full story. Because breakups are painful enough on their own, but the ones that stay with people are the ones where one person seems shattered and the other seems strangely untouched, and right away that leaves a harder question hanging over everything. Whether this relationship was destroyed by one terrible final night, or whether that final night only exposed something that had already been slipping away for much longer than Elise wanted to admit. And what makes it worse is that this is not happening after weeks of distance with no expectations left. This is happening in the final hour before she leaves Australia, when most couples, even broken ones, would at least try to fake some tenderness, or force one last honest conversation, or at minimum show up. But instead, Elise is left sitting there, exhausted, hurt, and trying to make sense of the fact that Josh is gone, because he has left the apartment, turned off his location, and disappeared at the exact moment when his presence should have mattered most. And that detail lands hard, because it turns an argument into abandonment, it turns tension into disrespect, and it makes the audience feel the humiliation before they even hear the explanation. Because now, the issue is not just that the last night went badly, the issue is that in the final stretch of this relationship, when everything was on the line, Josh behaved like being there was optional. That is where the story starts getting uncomfortable in a more interesting way, because Elise is easy to feel for in this moment. She is emotional, visibly wounded, and clearly still reacting from a place where she wanted this to work, but the stronger reading is not that she is some perfect victim and Josh is some easy cartoon villain. The stronger reading is that these were always two unstable people moving toward a test they were probably never built to pass, because Elise still wanted emotional proof and Josh was already moving with the energy of someone who saw this relationship as another source of pressure, another thing to manage, another thing asking more from him than he wanted to give. And when people reach that point, they do not always leave with honesty first. Sometimes they leave with distance first, avoidance first, silence first. And that is what makes Josh feel so slippery here, not because we need to invent motives for him, but because his actions are doing all the talking while his words keep falling behind. And the timing is what really poisons the whole scene, because this is not just some random bad morning. This happened after a tense dinner, after a party, after Elise ended up crying alone in the bedroom on the very last night they had together. So now every missing piece starts to feel loaded. Was the party careless? Was it selfish? Was it a distraction? Was it a message? Did Josh stop trying long before the airport? Did Elise already feel that and just refuse to name it until now? And maybe the ugliest question of all is whether the breakup itself is not even the most revealing part of this story. Because the more you look at Josh's reaction, the more it starts to feel like the real evidence is not what he says when Elise ends it, but how little it seems to cost him in the moment. And that is the kind of detail that turns one bad night into something much harder to shake. What makes this last night so damaging is not just that it went badly. It is that it went badly in a way that feels almost impossible to defend once you slow it down and look at the order of events. Because this was not some random midweek argument where both people were tired and careless. This was Elise's final night in Australia. The one night that should have carried at least a little weight even if the relationship was already under pressure, and instead of creating any kind of private space, Josh brings friends over after a tense dinner, and not just friends in the abstract either, but a mixed group that includes women, which immediately changes the emotional temperature of the whole thing, because even if nothing inappropriate happened, the choice itself is what stings. The choice to fill the apartment with noise and other people when your partner is already hurting and the relationship is already unstable. And that is why this stops feeling like ordinary immaturity and starts feeling like something more revealing about how Josh handles closeness when closeness starts demanding something real from him. And the reason this part works so well in the story is that it would actually be easier if it were more clean-cut. If Josh had just openly said he did not care or Elise had caught him doing something undeniable, because then the audience could relax into certainty. But that is not what happens. Here, and messy truth always holds attention longer than neat truth. Because Josh's defense is not absurd on its face, he says Elise knew the friends were coming. He says she agreed, and he frames the blow-up as something she triggered once the group arrived, which matters because it introduces just enough doubt to stop the audience from locking the case too early, not enough doubt to erase the disrespect, but enough to complicate motive, because now the question becomes whether Josh is rewriting the night to make himself look less reckless, or whether Elise did technically agree, but emotionally expected him to read the room and act differently once it became obvious the night was already fragile. That is where the emotional injury gets sharper, because Elise's pain here is not just sadness, it is humiliation. And those are not the same thing. Sadness says this hurts. Humiliation says I was made to feel small, secondary, replaceable. And that is exactly the feeling this setup creates. Because while Josh keeps the social energy going outside, Elise is alone in the bedroom crying on the final night of a trip that was supposed to mean something, and once you picture that clearly, the damage becomes bigger than the argument itself, because whether she technically agreed or not starts mattering a little less than the fact that he still let the night become that. He still let her end up isolated while he carried on. He still failed the emotional test in the one moment where even average effort would have gone a long way, and that is why even his friend not really. Defending the choice matters so much, because outside confirmation quietly tells the audience that this was not just Elise being dramatic, the setup itself was bad. But the smartest part of this section is that it refuses to give the audience emotional relief too early, because just when Josh starts looking fully disposable, he returns the next morning and slips into apology, whispering sorry again and again in a way that sounds intimate enough to suggest regret, yet not solid enough to repair anything, and that is exactly the kind of moment that keeps people watching, because apologies are supposed to settle the emotional score, and this one does not. It only creates a new question, whether Josh is truly ashamed now that the hangover and daylight have stripped away the party energy, or whether this is just damage control from a man who wants the consequences softened without really understanding why the hurt cuts so deep in the first place, and that is why the next step matters so much, because after all that noise, all that embarrassment, and all those apologies, the real test is no longer who was louder the night before, but who still has anything left worth fighting for when they get in that car to the airport. By the time they get into the car, the argument is no longer really about the party. And that is what gives this section its weight, because once a couple reaches the airport with this much damage already sitting between them, the details of the night before start turning into something else, something larger and harder to walk back. And you can feel that immediately in the way Elise is still talking like someone trying to pin meaning to the pain, while Josh is talking like someone who wants the moment to shrink back down into a regrettable incident. And those are two completely different emotional agendas, because she is trying to say, this meant something, this hurt for a reason, this showed me something I cannot unsee, while he is trying to say it was bad, yes, but it was survivable. It was another bump. Another fight, another thing that should not have had the power to redefine the relationship unless she chose to let it. That is why the ride to the airport matters so much more than people think, because this is where the story stops being about what happened and starts being about who these two people are when love requires accountability instead of chemistry, and Elise is clearly still sitting in the emotional reality of that last night. Still feeling the insult of being left alone, still carrying the weight of a goodbye that should have been intimate and instead became chaotic and lonely, while Josh sounds like a man who has reached the end of his tolerance for emotional repetition. And maybe there is a counterpoint there. Maybe in his mind he really has apologized, really has explained, really is exhausted by conflict that keeps reopening, but even if you give him that much, even if you grant him the most generous reading available, the deeper problem still does not go away, because people can be tired and still show heartbreak people can feel blamed unfairly and still act like losing someone matters, and that is where Josh becomes so hard to read in a way that keeps the whole scene alive. Because the worst part is not that he says sorry. The worst part is how empty the sorry begins to feel once it has to compete with his energy, and that is where the audience gets trapped in the most uncomfortable question of the whole breakup, whether Josh is calm because he is avoidant, whether he is calm because he is emotionally worn out, or whether he is calm because some part of him has already left this relationship behind and the airport is just the official paperwork, and the script should not rush to answer that too fast, because the discomfort of not knowing is exactly what makes his reaction more haunting than loud cruelty would have been, since loud cruelty would at least confirm investment, but this kind of cool, restrained, nearly flat response creates a colder possibility that Elise is finally speaking aloud what Josh has privately stopped resisting. And Elise feels that, which is why the emotional force of her side is not just anger, it is recognition mixed with hurt, because when she says he ruined their last night, she is not only accusing him of bad behavior, she is naming what the behavior proved, that in the moment where she needed to feel chosen, protected, or even just considered, she instead felt like an inconvenience orbiting around his impulses, and when Josh pushes back by saying that if every speed bump becomes this massive issue, then it will never work, the conflict becomes almost impossible to fix, because now they are not debating facts, they are debating meaning, and once two people disagree on meaning at that level, repair usually becomes performance rather than repair, because in her reality, the party revealed she was never the priority, and in his reality, her reaction reveals she will never let anything go, and those two positions cancel each other out. So when Elise finally says she cannot do this anymore, the breakup itself almost feels less dramatic than the silence around it, because this is the moment where some viewers will expect Josh to wake up, to panic, to fight, to show that whatever his flaws, the loss has finally hit him in the chest. But instead what lands is something much more unsettling, an answer that barely sounds like an answer, a reaction so measured it almost feels emotionally vacant, and that is the point where the breakup turns into a character verdict whether he means it to or not, because viewers can forgive recklessness more easily than they forgive indifference. They can forgive a stupid night more easily than they forgive a man who looks almost relieved that the emotional tension is finally over. And maybe that reading is too harsh. Maybe he is simply the kind of person who shuts down under emotional pressure. Maybe he really is devastated in ways he does not know how to show. But the brutal truth is that in moments like this, people are judged by what their absence feels like. And Josh's reaction does not soften the breakup. It deepens it, because it suggests the real loss may not have happened at the airport at all. It may have happened much earlier, when one of them was still trying to save meaning, and the other had already started surviving distance. Once the airport scene is over, the story actually gets heavier, not lighter, because the breakup itself is not the final revelation. It is the moment that forces everything else into focus, and Elise's pain starts to read less like the shock of one terrible night and more like the collapse of a hope she had been carrying for much longer than she probably should have, because when she says she came to Australia excited to find love and is now leaving alone, that line lands so hard precisely because it strips away all the noise and leaves the real damage sitting there in plain view, which is not just that Josh hurt her, but that she invested in a version of this relationship that kept asking her to believe tomorrow would feel more secure than today, even while the signs kept stacking up that tomorrow was probably going to look a lot like the mess she was already standing in. And that is where this stops being a story about one humiliating final night and starts becoming a story about a pattern. Because once Elise begins naming what was wrong, the relationship changes shape in front of the audience, and what first looked like one reckless decision starts to connect to everything else she had been trying to manage: his work situation, his son, his living setup, his friends, the partying, his overall personality. And the smart way to handle that in the narration is not to dump those things like a grocery list, but to let them build one by one so the audience can feel what Elise finally seems to be feeling, that each issue on its own may not have been fatal, each one may even have been explainable, but taken together they create a relationship that kept requiring her to adapt downward, to become more flexible, more patient, more understanding, more forgiving, until the version of love she was fighting for started asking her to ignore the difference between compromise and erosion. That is the deeper power shift in this section, and it is more interesting than simple victim versus villain framing, because on the surface, Elise looks like the weaker one. She is crying, she is grieving, she is the visibly broken one, while Josh remains calm, but emotionally, that may know. Longer mean what it looked like at first, because by this point, Elise is actually the one doing the harder thing. She is the one finally naming the truth instead of surviving inside the confusion, and Josh's calm, which might have read earlier like steadiness or self-control, starts to take on a different meaning once the full context settles in, because now it can look less like strength and more like evidence that he was never carrying the same emotional load, never holding the same future in his mind with the same urgency, never really operating under the same stakes. And that reading is what gives this act its pain, because it forces a more brutal possibility than the easy one, which is that the relationship did not fail, because Josh is some one-note monster and Elise is some flawless believer. It failed because one person may have been trying to love a mismatch into becoming commitment, and that kind of failure is harder to watch because it feels so human. Because people do this all the time. They see the warnings, they name the concerns, they feel the distance, but they keep hoping effort can create depth, hoping patience can create readiness, hoping enough emotional generosity can finally make the other person meet them at the same level. And when that hope breaks, the pain is not just heartbreak, it is embarrassment, grief, and the sick realization that you may have been working much harder than the relationship itself ever was. That is why Josh saying he gave his best is such a devastating line in this part of the story, because at first it can sound like a defense, the kind of standard breakup language people use when they want to exit without sounding cruel, but if you sit with it for even a second, it opens a much worse interpretation. Because what if that really was his best? What if this was not a case of one fixable mistake, or one bad final night, or one apology delivered too late? What if this relationship kept hitting the same emotional wall because Josh's actual capacity was always lower than Elise's? Expectations and hopes needed it to be, and if that is true, then the sadness of this story changes again, because now the tragedy is not that he failed to become the right partner at the last minute, it is that she may have been trying to build a future out of signals that were never going to hold that much weight in the first place. And that should be the final sting of this section, because once the red flags stop looking random and start looking structural, the audience is left with the hardest question yet. Not whether the final night was bad, not whether Josh behaved selfishly, not even whether Elise had the right to walk away. All of that is already on the table. The more painful question is whether the relationship was unstable long before the airport and the final visit simply made it impossible to keep pretending otherwise. Because if Josh says he gave his best, and his best still looked like this, then the question hanging over everything is the one that hurts most of all. What exactly was Elise fighting to save? The hardest truth in this story is that the breakup itself was not the real shock, even though that is how it first lands. Because what actually makes this ending stick is the slower realization that the final night did not create the collapse, it exposed it, and that distinction matters. Because a relationship destroyed by one reckless night still leaves room for the fantasy that without that one mistake, maybe everything could have held together. But this does not really play like that once all the pieces are sitting in front of us. Because the party was not the whole story. It was evidence. The disappearing act was not the whole story. It was evidence. Even the apology was not the whole story. It was evidence, and once you start reading the final hours that way, the shape of the relationship changes from a sudden blow-up into something sadder and more familiar, a bond that had already started thinning out long before either of them said it clearly. That is why Josh's calm at the airport ends up mattering more than the party itself, because the party shows bad judgment, but the airport shows emotional weight. And those are not the same thing, because people can make selfish decisions and still panic when they realize they are about to lose. People can mess up badly and still react with visible fear when the relationship finally slips out of reach, but Josh's reaction does not feel like that. It feels more like confirmation than shock, more like a man standing inside an ending he had already stopped fighting internally. And Maybe that is not because he is some cold-blooded monster. Maybe it is because he is conflict avoidant. Maybe it is because he shuts down under pressure. Maybe it is because emotional intensity makes him go flat instead of expressive. But even the most generous reading does not really rescue the bigger point. Because whatever his inner reason was, the relationship was clearly not costing him in the same way it was costing Elise. And that is where Elise's heartbreak becomes easier to understand and harder to dismiss, because she is not only mourning a man, she is mourning the version of the relationship she kept hoping was real. The version where the red flags were temporary, the distance was manageable, the mismatch was fixable, the bad moments were isolated, and the effort would finally turn into something secure if she just held on long enough to reach it. And losing that kind of hope always hurts more than people expect, because it is not just romantic loss, it is the collapse of a private narrative. The one that keeps telling you this will make sense soon, this will settle soon, this will finally feel mutual soon, and when that story dies, you do not just lose the person, you lose the meaning you had attached to them. That is why the stronger conclusion here is not that Josh was some giant villain twirling his mustache through the final night like a budget soap opera clown. It is something more ordinary, and in some ways more damaging, that his words kept outrunning his real commitment, that he may have liked the relationship more than he was prepared to protect it, that he may have still cared in some limited way, without ever carrying it with the seriousness Elise needed, and that kind of mismatch leaves the other person trapped in the worst possible position, still decoding, still hoping, still trying to turn mixed signals into clarity after clarity should have already arrived. So the real answer is harsher than the breakup, because the breakup was only the official ending, while the deeper ending had probably already happened earlier, when one person was still trying to save the meaning of the relationship, and the other had already started living without that meaning, fully in his hands. And that is the final insight that actually stays with people, because some relationships do not end the day someone says it is over. They end the day one person finally realizes they have been carrying the emotional weight mostly alone.